I wanted to say that today we're going to have a two-part hearing. Part A will be a review of the administration's cap-and-trade proposal, and Part B will review the governor's proposal for high-speed rail. We will take testimony on the cap-and-trade at the end of Part A. So we're going to hear all the presentations first, and then after we hear the presentations, we'll take testimony on those items. The committee will take written testimony as well on these issues. We would persevere among you to submit written testimony. The Part A that we're going to begin with, the governor's cap-and-trade transportation proposals, is the first item. We're going to have the Department of Finance make an opening statement. When the departments present their make their presentations, I would request that they address three basic questions, and it would help expedite the meeting if we receive public testimony on these three basic items also. First, the amount of greenhouse gases that will be reduced as part of the proposal in your particular area, how that will be quantified, and how quickly those reductions can begin. In other words, what's the timeline for those reductions? What I don't want to have happen is I don't want people to come up and say how great their programs are or how important their programs are, because we know how great your programs are. We just want to talk now about cap and trade. We want to hear the answer to those three questions. We're not going to take action today. We're going to hear and receive information. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I will if somebody strays off the directive that I just gave. Okay? So thank you very much, and we have Karen Finn here. Karen, welcome, a program budget manager from our Department of Finance, and welcome. And I'll turn the floor over to you, Karen, and you can make your initial opening remarks. Thank you.
Again, I just want to take a few minutes. I don't want to belabor. You already had a nice overview session on the program a couple months ago, but I just wanted to kind of start off because you are going to hear some nice things about the programs that are from these people that are sitting behind me. First of all, I just want to compliment your staff who have summarized nicely all the legislative direction and requirements that you have placed upon the administration and all those legislative proposals that have passed up till now. Today, we hope you will see a consistent acknowledgement of those requirements from the agencies, and hope you see an effort on their part to keep striving to meet those requirements. Just to summarize where we are in terms of this whole program, as you all know, AB 32 was passed in 2006. These cap-and-trade auctions started in November of 2012. And a 3-year investment plan was submitted last spring for the expenditure of cap and trade. And now we have before you an investment plan was submitted, and now we have a specific expenditure plan that is before you. And I will assure you that we have had legal discussion on all the proposals, and we're confident that these are all legal expenditures of proceeds, and most importantly, will further the purposes of AB 32. And just referring back to the chair's discussion about the metrics and how folks are anxious to know how many emission reductions and when those benefits will start, as well as where, most importantly, too, where all these benefits to disadvantaged communities are going to be. We hope that as you listen to each of the departments behind us, that you appreciate that maybe not all that much specific information is known right now, because, as you know, much of this funding will be allocated in competitive grants. But we want you to also know that when we start reporting metrics, that it's incumbent upon all of us to be consistent in the metrics that we report. And for example, what I mean is when energy projects are undertaken, for example, by the Community Services Department, that those same emission metrics will be used for similar projects that maybe the Strategic Growth Council undertakes in their projects. So those are still the things that we're working on, and when Air Board is up here, I'm sure they can help explain what they're going to be doing to help all these other departments. But again, that being said, each department here will be able to tell you how the funding in their program will achieve emissions reductions, and most importantly, other benefits, and they should also be able to tell you relevant studies or analysis in the areas of emissions reductions, whether it's in the urban forestry programs or supporting sustainable freight technology. And lastly, we've heard much about whether this complement of programs that you're going to hear is the right mix to maximize GHG reductions. And I just want to remind you that the legislature has not asked us to maximize GHG reductions, but rather you've also asked us to consider many other things that might not result in maximizing reductions. That is, you've asked us to consider investments in disadvantaged communities, asked us to consider public health benefits, and other environmental and economic impacts. And again, the departments today should be able to talk to where those benefits will eventually be achieved. And lastly, a reminder that there's also been concern that will some of these reductions occur before 2020 or after. And again, there's no requirement that any of these reductions happen before 2020, and that's why our plan is it's a combination of programs that will achieve both near-term reductions as well as long-term reductions. With that, I would answer any quick questions or let it turn over to you for our departments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen, the question I would have is that before we finalize our budget, we would like to get an idea of the relative merit of the categories, not necessarily the specific projects, but we would like to have the relative merit of the various categories in terms of achieving emission reductions by 2020, so we can get a understanding of the relevance of the particular categories. And we would also like to have an idea on the cost effectiveness of those proposals, because we are spending the taxpayers' money. Sure. And I think that's a job that you can help us with and throughout this process over the next few months. Thank you for coming here. Do any members have any questions? Questions? Okay. Senator Nielsen, you have the floor.
Thank you for being here today. You spoke about the metrics. Now, those are kind of very important guidelines for the future. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And will those? How do those metrics get put into effect? Do they go through a regulation and then Office of Administrative Law, or is this just by a DOM, or Department of Operational Memo, or how do you affect the metrics?
Again, I think each department will be able to address it, but I don't envision any regulatory. I think we're going to set out some guidelines, so as I mentioned, that when departments are reporting metrics, whether it's impacts in disadvantaged communities, whether it's jobs created, whether it's emissions reduced, that there's some consistent metrics so that the departments aren't coming up with the same. So
I appreciate that consistent metrics all over. That's so everybody's playing from the same rules. That's important.
Right.
Now, I believe that there's probably some legal problems with this because the funds and the reductions, there may not be any connection or nexus, which is required. There be a nexus. How are you establishing any nexus from what we're doing to be doing to what it really means to a beneficiary who's paying and playing in the cap and trade? How do we know? The nexus to the benefit to the person who's doing in the cap and trade, and they're going to give credits or buy credits and such. What's the benefit to them?
Well, the benefit will be achieved, will be realized by where the investments are made, not necessarily back. You're talking about the actual entity who purchased the cap and trade entity.
Yeah, and right. What legal criteria do you
all I can tell, excuse me,
justify the expenditures you're using from the cap and trade revenues that came from any number of entities who play?
All I can tell you is that the legal team at both Air Board, the Attorney General's office has reviewed everything, and they are confident that the expenditures that we are proposing are consistent with the uses of the funds.
Okay, I understand. I would just argue that they ought to be persistently vigilant about that, because it's a very dicey area subject to litigation, I believe.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, on one last question. On the high-speed rail, right-of-way acquisition, is it anticipated that eminent domain will be used for any acquisitions of property?
Correct, yes.
It will be, okay. Another area that I'm very sensitive to, and I may have some additional, more specific questions related to eminent domain for property acquisition, particularly down in the San Joaquin Valley. Thank you.
Now, when we get to that Part B part of the hearing, not this part, Part A, but Part B, we have a whole section on high-speed rail, and that's when you can ask all the questions you want to ask on all those high-speed rail issues. So, but right now, we're focused right now on the cap and trade, and I think one of the things we're trying to do is establish some due diligence regarding the issue of connecting the use of the funds to the benefits, so that we do have some straightforward connections.
Understand.
The Sinclair paint decision, which was modified by the voters, but still held that there is a connection that you can establish between a mitigation fee and use of the funds to mitigate, and we're trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions with these funds. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I think we have to have some due diligence in our proceedings as a legislative body and as the budget office to make sure that these funds are not used in general sense, but are used in a specific mitigation sense to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why we're going to ask those specific questions.
Good.
I am very familiar with the Sinclair case decision since one of the 5 counties that initiated that particular lawsuit was Santa Clara County. While I was chairman of the Board of Supervisors of that county, we initiated that lawsuit. So I'm very familiar with the Sinclair decision. I wanted to thank you, Karen, and we'll go right into our hearing. And the first person, we have the High-Speed Rail Authority's Chief Executive Officer, Jeff Morales, is up, and we'll limit our presentations to about 5 minutes. And welcome, Jeff. And we have Brian Ennis from the Deputy Director of the Department of Transportation. So welcome, gentlemen, and we'll turn the floor over to you to make your presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Focusing specifically on cap and trade, I want to start by noting that high-speed rail has been identified by the ARB in its scoping plan from the beginning, from the passage of AB 32 and the development of its first scoping plan back in 2008, which actually preceded the passage of Proposition 1A. And I think it really was a recognition of a few factors. One, that in California, transportation contributes a far greater percentage of greenhouse gas emissions than in other states. Typically, utilities is the largest contributor here in California because of steps that have been taken in that field. It's actually transportation, which accounts for about 40% of emissions. That's why you see such a strong commitment to transportation in the governor's proposal for cap and trade in this initial plan, including high-speed rail as part of an overall rail modernization program. I do want to point out, and I think the intent here is, and the recognition that certainly not just between now and 2020, but looking beyond as we face continued population growth in the state, we need to be able to provide people with viable alternatives of how they can travel and how we can move goods and services in the state. And all too often today, people have no practical choice intra-regionally of doing anything but driving, and very often driving in single-occupant vehicles. and interregionally have very little choice but to drive very long distance or fly. And so a rail modernization program gets at both of those elements, providing the interregional connectivity for the state with high-speed rail and working together with local and regional transit to provide people with real alternatives and make the whole system function much more effectively. Getting to your three questions, I want to talk just quickly. We do have reductions that will be occurring through the program pre-2020. We project, and we can provide the committee with the full details on this. It was submitted in a report to the legislature last July. But reductions of estimates ranging from 278,000 to 674,000 metric tons pre-2020, and that's through a variety of things happening as a result of the program, including a commitment to net zero emissions during construction, but also things like the Caltrain electrification program, which is going forward as part of this program, and according to Caltrain will produce 68,000 tons reduction when implemented when implemented in 2019. We also see the transit projects that are being funded as part of our program, like the LA Regional Connector project, which is will allow east-west connections on the subway system there of reductions of over 63,000 tons annually. Once high-speed rail is up and running, we project reductions of at least 141 to 330,000 metric tons a year, and then ultimately approximately 2 million tons a year of reduction, and that's just from the direct mode shift of people getting out of cars and traveling on train instead of plane as well. Brian, do you want to jump in? Okay. A few things on environmental justice and the SB 535 goals. Very important. We know to the committee, to the legislature, and to us, and there are several different ways which investment in our program really speaks to that. One is when we talk about investment in disadvantaged communities, some of the very most disadvantaged communities in the state and even in the country are in the Central Valley, where unemployment rates remain in double digits, 50% above the state average. Construction unemployment is in 25% range in many cases, and it's been stuck there for a very long time. Direct investment in here will have a direct impact on creation of jobs in those disadvantaged areas. We are also doing a number of things to improve air quality in those areas directly, beyond the long-term conversion that will come with high-speed rail. Things like a cooperative agreement with the San Joaquin Air District, which will result in the replacement of diesel irrigation pumps with electric pumps, things like that. And that's a metric we would use, in fact, to measure things. Urban forestry, which can be a powerful tool both in the Central Valley and elsewhere in the state, again, directly benefiting disadvantaged communities. Long-term, connecting those disadvantaged communities with the larger economic centers of the state and with the job opportunities that are there is an outcome of this program. And the fourth area would be the investments that are being made as a result of the changes in our program and what the legislature did in enacting the Budget Act of 2012 by investing directly in local and regional transit that connects to the high-speed rail system, making transit more accessible, practical, and affordable throughout the state, and by working with local providers to really improve transit throughout. That may have been my 5 minutes, so I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, I had just a generic question. So when you do your estimating, I appreciate you laying down the numbers for us, and those kinds of things probably would be best digested by me by sending a memo on that issue. But I'd like to ask you, is that based on the base high-speed rail project as approved that you have in the plan, the adopted plan?
It is, and it's.
So you're looking at the metrics that are produced by the basic high-speed rail plan.
Yes, and as implemented in phases. So
Yes, right.
we don't wait for the kind of the big bang of reductions, but at each stage along the program, we can demonstrate what sort of reductions will occur as we move
You
forward.
have information that compares the information you gave us today with the finished complete product, what would happen when you finish, so we can see the initial by 2020
Yes.
versus 2028?
Yes, we do, Senator, and we
I
can.
would like to see
Yes, we
that.
can provide all of
See,
it. Yes.
Here's that first part, and then here's the second part, so we can kind of look at it in a sense how that would play out.
Yes, we can, and
Judge the quantify and judge the merit of your proposal to use the cap and trade funds.
yes, we're happy to provide that. One thing I would note, and I believe the same would be true of looking at transit investments, which I know you're very interested in. The numbers we present are, I believe we can make a strong case, are really just kind of the tip of the iceberg in that they represent the direct shift of mode shift in essence, getting, the value of taking people out of cars and onto a train and out of planes onto a train. What we're not capturing, because frankly we don't want to put out numbers we can't really fully validate, are the more transformative impacts that come with making rail a real option in the state. The SB 375 goals of more sustainable communities, how we capture those broader benefits of transit-oriented development and things like that, we're not accounting for those in our numbers. So I think that the actual numbers at the end of the day will be far bigger.
Thank you. Thank you. Other questions from Senator Jackson?
Yeah, you provided us with a number of the estimates on the amount of metric tons that you think will be reduced and so forth, and a lot of fairly optimistic numbers. I mean, obviously that's the purpose, is to reduce greenhouse gases. That's how you're linking in taking the cap and trade funds is with the high-speed rail. And I'm just wondering, what is the basis of those numbers? Are they optimistic, pessimistic? What we can all throw out numbers. I'm wondering where those numbers
Sure, and we can, in the report we submitted to the legislature in July, we laid out the methodology and the sources, and we'd be happy to provide and update you on that. But I'll just, I would describe them as conservative and industry standard. We use databases that go, and most of it again is derived based on looking at our demand modeling, which looks at ridership and where people will be coming from and how they travel, and then making calculations about mode shift. So for instance, we use the what's called the MFAC database, which is an ARB approved database that is about the emissions for on-road vehicles. That's one source of the calculation. We use federal aviation databases for emissions from airplanes and those calculations and apply them. All of that then is vetted externally and was reviewed by the ARB and determined to be appropriate for our calculations. So I would characterize our projections as realistic and appropriate.
the potential delays because of litigation, which either has already started or we know is coming, and some of the other expenses associated with purchasing by eminent domain. Senator Nielsen doesn't like that, but I suspect that there are others who will express that same consternation. So have you factored in all the pluses and the minuses that we can, I think, realistically anticipate as this project proceeds?
We do, and some of this may be in Part B of the hearing, but when we talk about the greenhouse gas reductions, those are tied to stages of the program. So, at whatever point a certain section is in place is when we would achieve those reductions. If the time frame is delayed, that would delay the reduction. Yes. I mean, so what we're tying to is a schedule that we believe is the best estimate of what our schedule is, but again, it traces back to physical construction and assets.
And did you factor into all of these considerations the reduction in greenhouse gases if we were to try another approach, for example, expanding inner-city rail, expanding programs that already exist, ridership that's known, and expanding that out? Are those factored into the numbers that you come up with in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases?
Our numbers specific to high-speed rail really, again, look at the high-speed rail system. We don't take into account fully the benefits of the connecting services, whether they're local transit or inner-city rail. That's, the other part of the governor's proposal is to fund those programs. And so there's no question there are benefits to be gained by investment in those systems, and the proposal is to do both, to be investing in both of them.
So is there someone, that's the proposal. I'm just wondering if we were willing to consider potentially shifting gears at the moment and focusing our attention more heavily on the inner-city rail and commuter rail, which, I'm chairing the select committee on passenger rail, and certainly there are potential benefits associated with that that are more immediate. And I'm wondering if anyone has crunched those numbers, and if so, who it is, so that as we move forward as a legislature, we can make informed decisions about the potential benefits of, again, you want to do both. There are some concerns. We have to weigh back and forth whether some of the additional costs, perhaps, or the delays that are coming, just because of litigation or what have you, whether there might be other avenues that we could proceed with that would reduce greenhouse gases in more rapidly and perhaps more effectively. So who's doing that, or is anybody doing that?
Sure. Brian Annis from the Transportation Agency, and I can address that. And this, I think, also overlaps a bit with the next item on the agenda for the rail modernization component of the program.
I'll withdraw the question until you complete that, but if you could incorporate that, that's really a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Senator Nielsen, you have the floor.
Trees. Now, is this all urban forestation, or are we going to do some agricultural trees too? Is this all proposed to be urban forestation?
We don't. We haven't specified which it is. We have a number of things we're doing as part of the program. And as part of our commitment to be zero net emissions is a forestry program. We have not defined the geographic limits, whether all of those would be in the Central Valley, whether they might be beyond, and whether they'd all be urban or non-urban. We are also, as part of the program, I think it's important to note, doing quite a bit to set aside and protect in perpetuity agricultural land. We have agreements already reached, for instance, in Merced and Madera counties to fund a program to preserve ag land in those two counties as part of our program moving forward.
Well, please work with me specifically on the Williamson Act, okay? We're having to renew that this year, and I would appreciate some help on that, because that is a tool, and it has been for a very long time, the Williamson Act. In terms of trees, you also talked about pumps, and did I hear you say diesel engines too, or that there's something?
Yes.
And what are you anticipating with pumps and engines? The pumps are run by electricity or diesel. There's some surface water can be gravity flowing, but most has to be pumped.
What I was referring to is we are in the final stages of an agreement with the San Joaquin Air District to implement what's called a VERA, a Voluntary Emissions Reduction Agreement, which is something they use with most development projects as a way of mitigating any sort of impacts. And so through that program, we would be funding their priorities for cleaning the air in the Central Valley. And one of the things I mentioned was that's on their list is the replacement of diesel irrigation pumps with electric pumps. So again, what we would be doing is providing funding to their program to advance their goals within the region.
As long as you're doing things that keep the pumping costs economic, that's really critical. And keep in mind that the drought is causing thousands of acres of those permanent crops to be torn out. And I know that's not necessarily related, but it kind of is related too. You're not going to have the amount of trees for your carbon sequestration, at least in the trees. That can be a real serious problem in the valley. And again, in all manner, we have to be very cognizant of the economic considerations of everything we do. The cost of replacing pumps, and there can be help for those landowners to change those pumps and convert them to electric. That's fine. But understand, a lot of times these regulations, particularly the diesel emissions over the years, have been a real burden to the industry.